All right. Hey, guys. So I'm Palas Garza. This is another lecture I thought I'd do on the healing with the magic metals. This is about the fifth time I've done this presentation. Mercury's retrograde, and themes of retrogrades are repetition and having to do things over and over. So if it seems like I'm pissed throughout the presentation, it's because I am pissed, because I've done this so many times and I'm sick of it. Nevertheless, I'm going to do it again so you can see it. Let me go ahead and share this screen. But yeah, so this is that set aside, this presentation is mostly based on the works and the writings of Dennis William Hauck, who's an American, Hauck, who is an American alchemist who I admire immensely. But this applies to astrology and for medical astrologers, but really any type of astrologer, because it helps you kind of deepen your relationship with the sort of esoteric and sort of mystical aspects of how the planets affect the Earth. And metals are these sort of like talismanic representations of the planets. So yeah, let's go ahead and start. So yeah, you can check out my website or my blog, astrovedicus.wordpress.com. You can also just check out these other videos on Queer Astrology Club here on YouTube or wherever you're watching this. Let's start with a prayer before we begin. I'm going to start doing that from now on because it's important to sort of invoke higher powers. I don't want you to just think that this is all my bullshit that I'm spewing, but rather this is information that has been sort of transmitted to us in various routes, through various routes over the years. It's been preserved by the ancients, and it's been upheld by the modern students of alchemy. So let's begin. Go ahead and maybe just find some center within yourself. O wise Hermes, peace be upon you, King of Egypt, you who are the utterances and the etchings of the daughters of woman. You who transmit the one mind to reveal. Every essence is immortal. Every essence is unchangeable. Everything that is double. None of the forms that are stand still. Not all things are moved by a soul, but everything that can be is moved by a soul. Everything that suffers is sensible. Everything that can sense does indeed suffer. Free me from the bondage of ignorance and limited understanding. O immortal wisdom in all form, make yourself known. Before we begin with the metals, I kind of want to talk about the operations of alchemy and kind of how they relate to the sort of psychological implications of these metals and how they relate to the body, the spirit, and the soul simultaneously, these psychological developments. And certainly as a queer person, there's lots of mental health kind of issues and challenges in our community because we're sort of demonized and stigmatized and abused and pushed to the fringes of society. And so as such, I think it's important to understand that these mental trials and tribulations have to be seen within a larger context. And it's certainly not true that whatever you're feeling now is going to be forever, because it's not going to be like this always, whatever you're going through. And I just want to say that no matter where you are along your spiritual journey, or if you're just starting now, or if you've never even heard of alchemy, if you've never even heard of astrology. But, first thing in any sort of spiritual context, we have to meet Saturn. We have to meet the first step of lead. And we'll get into the planets and how they represent, how they are sort of syncretized with the metals and all that. Actually, I'm going to say metals probably a lot during this presentation. I wonder if we should play a drinking game where every time I say metals, you have to do a shot. Actually, let's not do that. But so the first step is calcination. That's when you sort of have to destroy your ego. You kind of have to get rid of your attachment to material possessions and all that sort of thing. That's kind of a no-brainer. And any sort of spiritual individual, Jesus, Buddha, whoever the fuck, there's always a calcination process where the ego must be destroyed or is severely tested. And then after that sort of, when your ego is turned, that sort of identity crisis you have, that midlife crisis that white men have in their 50s instead of, conscious people who have that in their earlier on, or who are seeking answers to higher questioning. Basically, after you turn that ego into ash, you need to dissolve it in water. That's called dissolution. And that's when you're going to immerse this identity into everything that you've rejected in your consciousness, in your subconscious, and your pre-conscious. Then after that, you're going to separate or filter that solution and discard any ungenuine or unworthy material. That's when you say, what is mine, what is not mine? You rediscover your essence. Then you recombine the saved elements from that filtration process in conjunction. So you separate, then you conjoin the things that you do want to keep, and it's a new type of union. It's a new type of personality that's sort of in its like seedhood. Then after that, you have fermentation. You have to take that material, then you have to test it in the reality that you're in society of others. You can't be in a Zen monastery all the time. In some ways, that's kind of like cheating. If you stay a monk forever, that's not really that hard, is it? No, it's not. It's not. What's hard is going out into the world and dealing with people who are not involved in the spiritual process, or who are at different levels of the spiritual evolution, or are just unawakened alchemists, you could call them. I think everyone is just an unawakened alchemist, or an unwitting alchemist, which can be dangerous, actually. So, after you ferment, this is type of like, are there fucking motor? Is there like a fucking, holy shit, hold on a second. I live downtown Seattle, and there's just I live by these fucking annoying like yuppie bars where these tech assholes try to score pussy with their terrible fashion sense. They wear khakis to bars. Don't wear khakis to bars. So after you ferment this new sort of consciousness, it's like your childlike state. And that we'll go into Mercury later. Trust me, we're going to go into these planets and these metals, but and these sort of violent processes. And this one certainly is kind of an ugly one too. When you ferment, everything putrefies. You have toxic, maybe gases going and la la la. But this is a death and resurrection phase. It's kind of like when Jesus dies and resurrects. And then that is the moment between the lower and the higher operations of alchemy. I think Mercury is kind of like this gatekeeper of the higher essences. Not that there's a hierarchy or there isn't a utility to all of these. I just I just want to be clear that there's an order of operations. After you ferment, you distill that fermented liquid, or that fermented consciousness, that transformative axis, that chrysalis version of you, whatever. It's very Scorpion in some ways. But you're going to want to raise the content of your psyche to the next highest possible level. That's when things are sort of in a pure, receptive, and like divine, intuitive state. So it's the same as dissolution in some way, but it's not, where you feel drowning in your emotions, where you feel drowning in that which was unconscious. Distillation is all of that is lighter. It moves from heavy cream to whipped cream, right? We're slowly refining. Each step, we're refining the product until finally we get to gold, when all of that distilled matter, all the steam and or the alcohol vapor, or the essential oil, or whatever the fuck you're trying to make, coagulates. And most people will sort of sense this as their immortal essence being awakened. And usually at this process, you discover like it's your undying self. People experience it as a second body of golden light, the ultima materia of their soul. People will, just because you get to gold doesn't mean you're done. You have to go through the process over and over again. And we'll see why with the signatures of lead. The signatures of gold are within lead. So lead is gold, and gold is lead. That's an illusion. Like, this whole thing is illusory. Like I said, the hierarchy doesn't exist. But there is a utility in the evolution, in the states of evolution of one between the other. Or de-evolution, that going back down. Because you certainly, psychologically, oftentimes you'll move up, say, or sorry, we'll go back. People will go from calcination to dissolution and then back to calcination. So most people actually spend their lives in the first two steps, calcination and dissolution here. Let's go ahead and talk about the first step, which is lead, or the first metal, rather. We're not on the steps anymore, but we're going to talk about how this metal relates to calcination and dissolving the ego. You'll see that you'll get the gist. You'll start to understand. This is an extremely long presentation, so I'm going to try to kind of just hit the key points, but it's still going to take a while. I might have to break it up into two. Oh yeah, what did I move? Saturn rules lead. These are kind of his attributes and his things about him. Lead is PB, plumbum, which means liquid silver. Looks like silver, it's shiny. Sacrificial lead is kind of like a martyr in a way, because it is usually found with gold and silver, and whenever you're smelting down the nobler metals, it can protect from bubbling and splattering, which silver does. It craters like the moon, as we'll see later. So, there's this sort of the great martyr, the great unseen work that is Saturn. Lead is the destroyer of light. It's impenetrable by all forms of radiation and light. It's used in glass making to absorb light, so the glass appears, less reflective and is more clear. It's non-corrosive, so it contains acids. That's very useful, isn't it? To something that won't erode. So all those properties of Saturn, when we call them like a hard ass or stubborn, it's like, yeah, but when there's very specific functions of that, like very specific and important utility to being a non-corrosive personality, which means you can't be manipulated and moved and changed and altered and swayed and seduced by life, Jupiter. Anyway, but this is Saturn. He's also the great deafener. He rules deafness even in the ears. Along with Mercury, it's not just Saturn. But traditionally, we've seen those signatures in the medieval tradition as well. Lead is used in sound deafening infrastructure, and you can put lead in, unleaded gasoline. Leaded gasoline. Why do we call it that? Because when you put lead in gasoline, it prevents it from knocking. It quiets the fuel combustion, and it makes it so you can actually have a conversation when you're riding in your car. Because without, mufflers and without anti-knocking fuel, probably the earliest cars were, deafening. The heaviest element is lead. No element can exceed it in weight. If you go beyond the weight of lead, you become radioactive. Basically, because it becomes an isotope of that eventually has to decay back into lead. It's not stable, right? These radioactive elements. And they decay in very predictable, and they decay in rhythmic and unalterable ways. And we can measure that specifically and faithfully. That's how we've dated the Earth. In fact, time is very relative, except when it comes to this process of using lead and radioactive isotopes. Because Caesar, the Roman calendar, the Celtic calendar, the Jewish calendar, the Chinese calendar, we all have this amazing way of culturally dividing time, which is not real, because time is not a cultural phenomenon. In a way it is, but according to astrology, it is, but it's the culture of the sun, right? It's a cultural construct, but it's the culture of the sun, not culture of humans. And that's where we have to kind of step back and realize that lead, though being poisonous, is incredibly important. It retards the mind, it gives mental retardation, it makes the body rigid, it paralyzes you, it's completely non-conducive to life. It stores in your bones forever, you can't get it out. And in concentrations, or in an analysis of kidney stones and gallstones, which I have friends and clients in Ayurveda who have these, if you were to study those stones, they're mostly comprised of various things, mineralized minerals, but also high contents of lead. Not surprising, right? So in powdered form, what's really cool about lead is it combusts just, kind of like spontaneously into a smokeless red flash of light. That means within it contains the power of the sun and the transformative access of the sun and the yearning for fire. And that's very Saturnian. And certainly the master of lead is fire. Even though it's a poor conductor, it melts and can be shaped into forms that are basically indestructible, because we have these old infrastructure from the Roman Empire. We have these, not only just plumbing, but other things as well, right? So lead is essentially inert, non-reactive, indestructible. It's the cold protector. PB, plumbing, lead. I mean, surely you can see the connection. It makes poisonous gases with all these types of, acid, salts and shit like that. Why do they do that? Why can't I never just like, why? I think lead represents the toil of the moon, because it's Saturnian in nature. And Saturn and the moon kind of have a lot in common. They're cold and kind of dark. They rule the darkness. The moon is bright, but it has a shadow side, does it not? The new moon. Saturn is kind of like the enabler of the moonarchy in some ways, and Saturn is feminine like the moon. Saturn is the revolutionary. It's a lot of times people associate it with bureaucracy and institutions and that which must be fought against or changed. And certainly there is that representation in like Greek mythology, Saturn being the head ripper of the new of his children, so they don't usurp him and overcome him and his authority. But really, Saturn represents the Titans and the feminine, like pre-patriarchal culture that was demonized by men and the solar cultures of Greece and of the Olympians and Apollo and Zeus and all those rapist scum that the Greeks seem to love, or at least they did back then, and that subsequently formed the basis of our rape culture. So Saturn is very anti that, although he is a baby killer. But I mean, you can't have everything. So yeah, Saturn represents kind of like the toil that goes unseen, the labor that goes unseen. It is he's a rock. He's the bounds of time, the bounds of the solar system in a lot of ways. No, back to them, right? The ancients, they couldn't see beyond Saturn, so they attributed to him all of these sort of dark and morose and somber ending of things: the death bringer, the sickle, the harvester who ends life by cutting it short. Right? So I like both of these images. I think the one on the right is kind of Capricornian, and then the one on the left is kind of more Aquarian, obviously. So here's a quote that's really fun by Jean-Paul Sartre. He says, he's very Saturnian: "I will take it all, tongues, molten lead, prongs, garrots, all that burns, all that tears. I want to truly suffer. Better 100 bites, better the whip, vitriol, than this suffering in the head." Vitriol is acid. "This ghost of suffering which grazes and caresses and never hurts enough." And certainly that represents the psychological process of calcination, when you have a perverted inability to actually transform yourself and transform your despair or your emotion. So apparently maybe Jean-Paul Sartre wasn't that good of an alchemist. Or just didn't have tools necessary to like prevent him from making that incredibly whiny and sadistic quote. But the lead temperament goes like this. Oh, and here you can see the image on the right, this soldier, I imagine a Roman soldier being killed and reduced back to his basic elements in basic form. It's almost as if like, the golden, shining, highfalutin armor is all stripped away. It will always be stripped away. All of your accomplishments will be stripped from you. Everything that you create will be taken from you. The sum result of all effort is ultimately nothing, is zero. You will be reduced to ash. This is an illusion. Your desires aren't real, and neither are your emotions. Oh, that's very leaden. Because Saturn is the abandoned star. He's physically oriented. He's motivated by obligation, not by inspiration. I have to do this because I have to, right? The water bearer. It's not like this joyous, in the image I like to see, I don't view him as being super happy there on the left. It's the toil that one is obligated to do. And it can come from a deep emotional sense of lack. So you're motivated by this sense of pessimism, or like the things you don't have, or the inadequacy of others. So I have to do it. You aren't going to do it, so I better do it. That's super Capricornian. That's super Aquarian. That's why they don't have friends. Just kidding. But I'm just totally. Also, you have to understand, sometimes I say things and I just don't mean them. But certainly the lead temperament is pragmatic. It's your ride or die. It's your zaddy. It controls your emotions through delaying, and sometimes gaslighting. Saturn, or the lead temperament, is someone who is religious but not spiritual. What does that mean? You often hear about people who are spiritual but not religious, but you can be the opposite even, and that's far more common, I think. You go through the motions, but your heart's not in it. You go through the motions, but your spirit's not in it. You go through the motions because you can't actually decide for yourself, because you're stuck in a loop. You're stuck in a groove that's been etched into you forever, because lead is this sort of, can get on a one-track mind, a sort of obsessive in some ways. But if lead absorbs the inner light and glass and things, it can show a person who, absorbs their own inner light and absorbs the inspiration from others, but also internalizes everything. So they may act totally like unfazed, right? But in reality, these Saturnian, these leaden people are absorbing every word and every insult, and they are putting it in their biology and their cells, and it forms cancers and all this shit, because they are not unaffected. They are not nonchalant. The world is sort of confirming all of their greatest pessimisms at all times, if they're unwilling to change or unwilling to evolve. These are like the horrible leaden aspects. They're suspicious of inspiration and genius. They want to, remain in what is practical, and things that are whimsical and untested and unknown can be dangerous. And, despair really only hurts when it is broken up by wishfulness and hopefulness. What was that? Who was that author that said, Quentin Crisp, who's kind of funny, who's an older English problematic queen, who says, after 4 years, the dust in my house doesn't get any worse. As if to argue, what's the point in cleaning? You just have to hold on long enough, until you just become immune to your own shit. So that's obnoxious. But, it's funny because these Saturnian types are slow and immovable, but they're restless, because inside of them is that fire of transformation and that inert freedom seeker seeking the freedom of fiery inspiration. So these, sometimes I'll see these Saturnian people, these leaden people, seek out fiery and dangerous situations eventually, and seek these intense danger, thrill-seeking things because they snap. And they're not honoring this process. They're not honoring what is yearning inside them. And so they become vitriolic. Because they can contain acids, these leaden people are incredibly mean. And I'm not talking like Mars mean or Jupiter mean. Those people aren't intelligent enough. They're not intelligent enough to be as mean as Saturn is. When Saturn is coming for your life, he's not spilling tea, he's spilling acid onto your lap, and it eats through your flesh. He's acid-tongued. Be warned that they are thinking the worst thing about you. They are. They're thinking it, if you can read it on their face. They're resistant to change and yet ache for it. They hold back their own personal power. But what's the secret is because leaden people are so in pain because they want to be loved for who they are, not what they do. And that usually never, because they sign up for so much work, they constantly sign up for situations or volunteer themselves in situations where they're being celebrated for what they do, for positions where they're hidden and where they're not seen and they're not being appreciated, where their work gets absorbed by someone else, someone else's name gets put on it. And as such, you see a self-loathing type. And it's because of that faulty calcination mechanism. They're not able to transform themselves. And then certainly, the point of alchemy is to move from a horizontal axis, which is so leaden and so materially based, the Muladhara, the base chakra, right? Sensory realm, the illusion involved in transactions with the illusory realm, which is necessary for life, and which is the foundation for spiritual growth, right? You can't evolve into meditation if you're being eaten by buzzards because you didn't feed yourself. And certainly some yogis go out, they have to go out into the woods and collect these dead yogis who have transcended. What kind of transcendence is that if you forget to eat? I beg your pardon, but I think that's more stupidity than that is something to be like, oh, but maybe I don't understand. No, I do understand. You just have to have an alchemical concept to realize that lead is not a useless state. It's important for the operations of spirituality. I'm going to probably talk about lead the most because it's kind of, to me, the most important, but these people are unimpressed. It's the opposite of inspiration, and they sort of, when it's configured with other planets, Saturn can bring a negative self-appraisal, especially with Venus, because of so many problems. And Saturn really gives you, when you're really in tune with lead, you can listen to when your body is saying no. You can maybe not have that third pack of cigarettes tonight. You can maybe stop, smoking crack every single day. You can maybe take more time off from work to deal with your heart disease because you don't have time to eat anything that isn't fried in carcinogenic oils. Am I saying that word? So my point being, the operation first, you have to burn yourself down to dust. Here's a story about a leaden person, a leaden woman. She killed her husband, 6 of them. She pours molten lead in their ears, so there's no trace of of any wrongdoing. And then she gets maybe their assets, and then she moves on to the next one and marries them. So she's on her 7th, and she's like, oh, for sure, this time, this is my hubby for reals. The 7th husband comes home one evening very drunk, but he wasn't really drunk. He was pretending because he was suspicious about this hoe. So having gone to bed, he pretended to be asleep. He was in a state of sleepiness, fake sleep. And she melts down some lead in a jiffy, gets this tube thing with a pipe, and she's like, okay, I'm going to pour it in your ear and kill you. Because she didn't want to date drunks anymore. She hated alcoholics. That was her story. But he woke up, realized he was trying to murder. He seized her, and consequently, they dug up the other bodies and found that there was lead in all their skulls. So this, to this story, I guess this is where we get the coroner's jury, or where we get the coroner's office, or where we get the death certificate, the necessity of really investigating how a person died to make sure that we're not overlooking foul play. So certainly that goes back to sort of the leaden qualities of hiddenness and baseness. So lead is medicine. So lead just sort of treats the bones, mineralization, strengthening skeleton, osteoporosis, atrophy. It stimulates the spleen, which Saturn rules. It dries tissue by strengthening them in the same way that when you pull a guitar string really tight, it gets stronger. It also stops visions, and it stops overactive imagination. So if you're having a bad trip, Saturn can slap you back into consciousness, right? It's like these wingnut hippies who don't have any alchemical training, or, they go out into my country, Mexico or whatever, and take, our healing herbs or ayahuasca or wherever they go, these white people, and then they fucking lose their shit. They might want to take some leaden medicines to help bring them back from their crushing self-investigation. So Saturn presides over the bones, like we said, and all that, and that's and the teeth. We see this lovely picture here of decay, which Saturn also rules. So let's move to 10. We're on to our next phase, or our next operation, our next metal. 10, and then we can see it's kind of in a raw form here. 10 cans were made of tin, but aluminum is not tin. So many of you don't know that, which is embarrassing for you. So stop embarrassing me. So white lead is what tin is called, because when you heat it, or when you try to enhance it, it turns white and kind of beautiful. and brilliant, but also becomes brittle if you don't mix it with stuff, as we'll see. It's non-weathering, it's non-oxidizing. Yeah, it's highly crystalline in nature. In fact, where we get the word tinker is from tin, because that's when you are playing with tin appliances and fixing them. And certainly tinkerers were romantic craftsmen who were doing just that. They would remelt down your shit, or just patch it, or whatever they had to do. These traveling groups, these nomadic groups in Europe. So the native metal is very rare in nature. It's only found with gold and copper, which is kind of like, makes sense, Jupiter as a benefic. It's also found where silica deposits are. Tin is found with silica a lot in the skin, and it kind of forms, it's in the boundaries, the outer layers of skin, and Jupiter has to deal with growth and expansion, and certainly our skin is taxed with our growth and expansion since the beginning of our lives, right? We're constantly ballooning out into various, we're sacks within sacks within sacks of water. But anyway, tin on its own disintegrates into a powdery substance whenever it's heated and then cooled, or cooled and then heated. And certainly that happened in England, because it blisters when when tin turns into powder. It infects the other tin it comes into contact with, and you get the tin plague. But tin can be, you can add what can you add to it? Bismuth? Some other things to make tin a little bit stronger, and it won't corrode. It'll be more useful, because tin on its own is really not that useful. Kind of just like Jupiter, but we'll see that later. Tin mixed with copper and zinc makes bronze. The Bronze Age was one of the most important artistic and one of the most what I consider the juiciest civilizations are during the Bronze Age, because you have a lot more interesting advancements. The people were still connected to nature, which you don't see in the Iron Age, which we're in now. Which you see the rape of the earth. I don't think it was necessarily happening as intensely as during the Bronze Age with copper. So solder is tin and lead. So Jupiter and Saturn make a substance that is used for joining things together, which is kind of nice. As if Jupiter kind of like pulls lead and makes it useful in a way beyond giving you bone cancer or poisoning your child with paint chips. So lead and, wait, that says lead and tin twice. So what is pewter made out of? Tin and, who the fuck knows? So my favorite part of this, as Dennis says, is that the distribution of tin on Earth follows the ecliptic angle of 23.5 degrees to the equator. That is the exact track of the orbit of Jupiter, slicing in a lightning bolt pattern along its path along the ecliptic, right? All the planets are kind of glued to the ecliptic plane at different declinations. But this is no haphazard effect, and really all the planets kind of follow that. Their path will be where their metal is distributed along the crust of the Earth. Tin is like the first step, the first metal that is liberated from the Saturnic prison. And we see that in the mythology when Rhea gives Saturn a stone and Jupiter is saved. And Jupiter can go on to form the rest of the pantheon, and be the god of, raping women. And here's Jupiter doing kind of just that. There's that horrific story of, not Daphne, who the fuck is it? The swan, and oh my god, I'm blanking on her name. This is really insane. Anyway, he just has an affinity for the feminine, and we'll see that. And we'll see here this picture. He's a baby because Jupiter is a baby. He has to be with other metals. Tin has to be with other metals before it's useful. The temperament of these people is jovial, lighthearted, luminous, regal. They project confidence even if it's unfounded, and they're superficial. But superficiality can be a good thing. Like if you're drowning in an ocean, which is, remember we talked about 10 being about dissolution. And when you are drowning in an ocean of your own emotions, you want that superficial life raft to be light and buoyant and floating to keep you alive, right? Lead medicine doesn't help you in dissolution because it makes you feel like you're drowning more, your own pessimism and your own negativity. So even though Jupiter has a lot of faults, he is a lifesaver. Psychologically, he's focused, Jupiter and the 10 temperament is focused on sensuality, right? Jupiter is pursuing pleasure at all times, almost exclusively pleasure. What does Jupiter really do besides seek women? Can you think of anything? Oh, and besides war, which is to get women or to get assets or to stop other people from getting women and assets. Anyway, so it's all very disgusting, isn't it? It's all very sad. Mythology is depressing. But Jupiter really can't control his impulses here either anyway. It's not like a self-controlled individual. So the Tin Man was known as being hollow-hearted. And during this process, a person can be dominated by dreams and powerful undercurrents when you're dissolved in that ocean. And that sort of thing can threaten our social standing and our social currency. So the 10 person might want to, not reveal what they're going through because of how that superficiality. So there's a negative part to that as well. It's almost as if psychology is complex. But Jupiterian energies are expansive and cheerful. They do bring prosperity. They're conductive and they seem to be everywhere at once. They can bend and be bent. That's the key signature of 10. It's easily malleable, it can be useful for making cheap and readily available things for people who don't have the money for the more rarer metals. Although tin is quite rare in its native form, and certainly getting rarer and rarer. We don't see it anymore. It's used. We've replaced it with aluminum. Anyways, 10 temperament people inspire action in others, and they're lovable, and sometimes they can be irreplaceable people in our lives. So we should cherish them, even if we think they're a little bit, even if a 10 type person who doesn't really want to go deep. And what is their medicine, this 10 temperament? This 10 metal. So Jupiter rules growth, so it involves the metabolic system, the liver, the tongue, saliva, and the fat metabolism. So Jupiter herbs and Jupiter plants and things that contain 10 are antispasmodic and hepatic. They promote healthy growth. When you combine Jupiter herbs or 10 herbs, in Ayurveda we use that as well. We use all the metals in these purified forms, which you should never do unless you've been trained in them. And I haven't even been trained in purifying these metals, which I want to go to India to do, but it's just so... Vaishajya Kalpana is such an interesting branch of Ayurveda because you really have, if you can make these metals pure and combine them with the right planetary herbs, you can achieve qualities of medicine that just exceed your neighborhood herb shop, right? Going and buying single herb tinctures and putting it in alcohol is bullshit. That's for some things, but that doesn't treat most disorders. You have to know what your constitution is. You have to understand alchemy to make good medicine. You can't just throw shit in vodka and call it a day, you lazy Americans. But, Jupiter and Mercury brings higher philosophy. Go figure. We're not stretching to understand this. Produces lightheartedness and gaiety. It can make things seem more surmountable, even if it isn't. If problems seem insurmountable. Flowers last longer in 10 vases. There's a preservation quality to 10. Its food is preserved in 10, so it has its beer tastes better in 10. 10 was used to alleviate mercury poisoning and vice versa because, and also they were seen kind of as opposites. And when you combine the oil of one to the other, you have a remedy for bipolar disorder. So now we're moving on to iron. So we can see iron is ruled by Mars. Its structure is very square. It forms like square, crystalline, hard, city-like, matrix-like structures. This is a little bit about it. It's chakra, it's bloodstone hematite. Its organ is the liver. I said Jupiter will deliver, and it does. But the liver is heavily involved with the blood, which Mars rules. So Mars and Jupiter are more alike than you think. And they both love war. And they're both not that good. I don't know if you know this, but almost every single, most of the, who funded the murderous crusades? It was a Jupiterian element funding the martial element. And it is always like that. Mars always seems to be working either at the request of Saturn or Jupiter. After lead, this is the second oldest metal. It's found in our core, but it's not really found in our crust naturally. Where we get it is from high impacts of meteorites. If you go to the cenotes in Mexico and Yucatan, which are just absolutely gorgeous, and you'll see a slide of them later, you'll see like these impacts were kind of awe-inspiring. The miles deep holes into the ground filled with water. I would love to scuba dive down there and go have like this, do some sort of weird martial iron remediation, and maybe just to die. I don't know. Maybe that's my suicide fantasy of the day. But Mars has a very high content of iron, and it's very red, right? So it gives you that rusty red color. Duh. Because it has a low copper content to balance it, I think that's why it became so uninhabitable. And certainly we're doomed to meet the fate of Mars. And it's our sister in that way, being societies of rust, iron, steel, and blood. Although there is speculation there's ice caps and maybe there was water on Mars, and who knows? Maybe we should cut him some slack. Mars. So, okay, iron makes steel, duh. You have to add carbon to that. They probably found that on accident. Someone dropped some carbon or near a fire and like realized that the resulting iron mixed with the carbon, it made a brittle cast iron. And maybe if you add a little bit more, it becomes really hard. Or maybe, you just play with the ratios until you could figure out different levels of useful utilities of steel and iron. Like the samurai sword or swords in general, you can shape it and meld it and fold it and bend it depending on how you mix it and how you smelt the ore down in your crucible. Iron became iron in Anglo-Saxon dialects, meaning holy metal, because it was used to kill brown people in the name of white supremacy during the Crusades. And I guess the Catholic Church was just tired of getting its ass kicked by the Muslims. But nonetheless, it was an inquisition of shameful proportion. Shame on you, Catholics. You all have blood on your hands. So ferrum, Fe is the Latin la, which comes from a root word fare, faire, forge, which means to do, to create, to bring forth. And that's certainly what a metalsmith is doing. That's certainly what an ironsmith is doing when he's making your metal, your metal shit. Also the chains and all of that, like slavery contraptions and all that, that's all Mars, right? Saturn is slavery, but Mars gives that ability with iron and with, so there we can kind of see how Mars is just a soldier and is often just a pawn and takes orders, either through the chief benefic or the chief primary malefic, Saturn. It's Jupiter. So steel through electricity becomes aluminum. So it's a modern metal, and it's pretty awful. And I'm pretty sure that, it's single-use shit. It's wasteful, it's awful. The alchemists would hate it and would be ashamed to know that that's what we're doing with alchemy. And that's where we're kind of stuck in the Iron Age, where I don't see us moving beyond it. The family of iron is manganese cobalts, which cobalts were like nixies, where we get nickel, is related to iron, and manganese is cobalt. But these were like mythological creatures in like medieval times, and then these names became part of our myth. That's what I'm saying. It's like you can't not be into mythology, even if you're a super science person. Like, pay attention. You don't even understand the words you're using. Like, you can't come at me with this, I'm not spiritual, I'm not religious, I don't believe in the gods, when your language is literally sculpted by the gods and the people who worship them. Nothing that you have created is yours. You've never even had a singular original thought in your entire life. Can you recognize that? Oh, and steel can be made to near diamond strength if you add some of those family things like vanadium or chromium. So that's cool. But iron is used for terrible things. You know, we make warehouses to store, you know, immigrant children after we rip them from their families. We shove them in a metal warehouse in the middle of Texas in 100 and whatever degree weather without access to showers or food. So that's one thing you can do with steel. Holy shit. Then we have these sort of like tipped arrows and the Iron Cross of the Nazis and the Prussian army, similar symbol. The Persian steel shields, iron shields. Yeah, the destruction of man. Kali dances in the Iron Age, you know? I think she is like I think Kali is like a blacksmith probably. She carries a big sword now in some versions of her. But how else she's gonna hack off the heads? How else is she gonna destroy your ego? You know? Really, how is she? So what's really cool about, this is kind of the most esoteric slide perhaps in the whole presentation. I think we're Martians. And like I said, I already said that, how we are sisters with Mars, but heavy dark iron oxides such as hematite, marcasite, magnetite, and siderite are the primary iron ores. So Rudolf Hauschka writes, as an alchemist, duh. The spiral tendency always arises when time enters space and develops towards a center. The fact that this dynamic shows up so clearly in iron ores, because they form iron in spiral shapes. I don't have any pictures, but they do. They form these interesting spirally gorgeous, almost like sea creature-like shapes. So, where was I? Where it transforms spherical forces quite unrelated to the laws of Earth into radial forces working towards a center. You might have to read this over. You may not. I don't think you're going to understand this the first time because I didn't. One can say that the function of iron is to help cosmic, weightless elements to enter the sphere of gravity. Iron is the only substance which makes visible in an archetypal picture the incarnating force during its spiral descent, which is Earth catching something in its gravity. For a path followed by meteors is indeed a spiral. Indeed, Mars helps us incarnate into form, and several alchemists describe the Iron Age as an active descent of the spirit into the lowest levels of human consciousness, and so at this stage of work, the spirit appears submerged in the body and as if extinguished in it. This is the outermost coagulation and the threshold of the final completion, the transformation of the body into the spirit become form. Wow, heavy. So we can't really understate the Martial influence. And here's one of those crater impacts, which is I think I've actually been to this one. Was it in Palenque? This might be the Palenque cenote. Actually, it's not. It's definitely not the Palenque one. So the iron temperament. Well, this is going to be a no-brainer. What is Mars like? The aggressive chemical hormonal impulse within us, both individually and collectively, right? It's the violence that you're okay with, right? You condemn some violence, but then some violence is okay, right? Because you're a hypocrite. Characteristics of anger. It's uncontrolled or aggressive self-assertion. It's that lust for power, the ego identity, the willpower. It's your courage. It's your ability to protect what you love. It's your ability to reinforce the ego and your individuality in a group. It's like Chango, the Orisa, who comes out like almost like emerging with his double axe to cut through the divine feminine, to kind of assert himself like in a lightning, fiery, chemical reaction kind of way. And certainly Chango is not so easy to work with all the time. Certainly he can be if you understand his nature. And isn't that the point of alchemy? Isn't that the point of why I'm talking right now? So you can understand what's going on inside you and how they relate to the metals. This stuff is related. You have to sit with it and you have to think about it. and you have to compare it to your chart. You have to understand, how is Mars doing in your chart? Am I gonna have am I gonna have the higher vibration form of Mars, or the lower, like, murderous rage kind of version? And you have to decide that for yourself with, hopefully a martial sense of scrutiny, because Martian people, the iron temperament, is logical. It wants to know why it's doing something. It doesn't just, and if you can explain why, it will be loyal to you and enact your will. So, it's the seat of our willpower. But by transmuting iron, we learn to assert we learn to assert ourselves without submission or domination, right? Because we don't want a weak Mars, we don't want to we don't want a weak Mars, and we don't want a strong Mars. We want a balanced Mars. So iron loves the air and makes these oxidates. So just as iron seeks fresh spirit and fresh change, iron also yearns for a liberation from its own nature. Arcanum, which is green vitriol, which is so important in dissolving gold, or eventually getting to gold ore, or not gold ore, but gold out of ore. It's a combination of iron and sulfur. So that's kind of our vitriol within inside us. That's our allotted transformational power, right? Without it, everything is going to be lost to illusion and complacency. And we're always just going to be hunting to sustain our limited temporal selves, ahamkara. We will get lost in illusion. Mars lost in illusion. Your Mars, your iron temperament, the iron person lost in illusion is a dangerous individual. You have to understand. They're like a free radical, this rogue agent of destruction. They will destroy everything they touch. They will destroy everything that they try to create, and they will destroy the creations of all those around them. So how do you transmute it? You have to use the operation of air, which is called separation. And certainly separation is great to do with a sword. By polarizing ourselves, we kind of move on to the second stage of evolution. It's so violent and so necessary. And Mars is pretty much always the destructive, as the representation of destructive fire is always the axis of metamorphosis in a lot of ways. And it's really here that you can start to see concrete personal changes. You've gone through the dissolution process of the ocean with tin, you've come to iron, you're really testing yourself here. This is your first spiritual exam, excuse me. Oh, here's a beautiful, is this a woodblock print of, if this is a woodblock print, this is a masterpiece of a Japanese sword, a samurai sword, which I consider to be the most aesthetically beautiful, but probably the weakest in terms of steel quality. The European steel is so much better, just because of the quality of that iron ore. How do you heal with iron? Well, Mars rules the blood, adrenal glands, male genitals, the non-specific immune system, right? Your first attack system, your phagocytes. Not your T cells and your B cells and all that specific acquired immunity. That's different. That's more mercurial. That's a learned thing. Mars is just, you're like, who are you? You don't belong here. So that's that. Mars effects Mars's effects are stimulating. So Martian elixirs release the action potential with soul of something. Martian herbs activate the potentialities of other herbs to a great degree, like cayenne pepper is used to help the things that you want digested to be broken down and digested so they can be transported and reach their target tissues. When you mix it with the sun herbs, they give a great physical energy, they tonify the muscles and increase sexual potency. Mars is incredibly sexual, lustful. Not even sexual, lustful, because it's it's so base. The iron temperament is someone who is self-reliant, so healing with iron and using iron will make you more self-reliant, spontaneous, and more independent. If you're a codependent person, you might need iron. You might need an iron Nazi cross to wear around your neck. Just kidding. An iron talisman. Okay, find one, get one, use one. Actually, an iron cross would be really, really powerful. Just make sure if if you make it or join it to other metals, that you choose it at an astrologically potent time. Don't be careless. Don't be lazy. You can't join gemstones to metals willy-nilly when you, it's upaye, like Sattva Vijaya Chikitsa, you need to talk to an Indian astrologer if you're going to be doing talismans, or a medieval one, or an alchemist who knows their shit. So yeah, I was going to say, iron is blood, and the iron molecule hemoglobin binds with oxygen. And certainly breathing is a form of burning. When you breathe in oxygen, you're literally, it's a type of combustion. Because, and manganese, which is the fiery brother, it's way more unstable than iron, just poof into gorgeous purplish, reddish, orangish, whatever light, performs the same function in chlorophyll in plants as iron does in the hemoglobin in our blood. So I'm going to say that again. So the manganese acts inside of plants as iron acts inside of our blood in terms of that oxygenation process. And in a sense, these two breathing metals are very similarly constructed. And not in a sense, just physically. Here's an image of green vitriol, which is what? Sulfur and iron. And you can see it's doing what? A lion dissolving the sun. So it has an affiliation in retrieving gold into a useful form, or forming it. So, oh, what's our time here? God, maybe I'll just do one more today for this video. The correspondences of copper. Well, copper is gorgeous. It's one of my favorites. You get all these cool rocks with it, or ores with it. You get like malachite, turquoise, azurite. Isn't that right? Yeah, all these really gorgeous stones. Copper is amazing. There's a cool laser ankh. Egyptian sarcophagus maybe, or maybe it's just a statue. Oh yeah, emerald, aventurine, 2. Copper is the organ, is the kidneys and throat, and its element is water. Certainly you always see Indian people carrying copper vessels containing their water because they want those copper atoms to leach into the water to improve Agni, the fires of the body. Okay, Venus and copper have been associated for aeons. Both are associated with love and intercourse. Copper, because it combines with so many things, is called meretrix metallorum, the harlot of the metals. It makes a lot of compounds, and it acts organically, pretty much just as much as silver, almost as much as silver within the body. And you don't really see crystals of it. It always looks like a sort of organic compound or foamy, bubbly. You know, it only forms crystals really with like 1 thing, 2 things. We'll just see what it forms crystals with later in Healing with Copper, which is coming next. But, you know, the discovery of copper dates to prehistoric times. It's been mined for so long, there's none left in the earth, basically. The word cuprum comes from copper, or rather, copper comes from cuprum, kipar, meaning Cyprus, that island where there was such a huge copper mine, a copper hub, which was used to make what? Bronze with what? Tin and zinc. Copper is a necessary chemical in venous blood that carries toxic substances to the excretory system. Therefore, you get, you know, the kidneys, the watery purifiers. In sea creatures, copper as hemocyanin takes the place of hemoglobin as the chemical of the blood and respiration. Copper is abundant in the female sex organs, conductive. Copper in the body is used up during sexual intercourse. Whoa. Highly conductive and malleable, making it first among ancient peoples for jewelry, makeup, weapons, medicine, talismans. Egyptian alchemy dealt heavily with copper and trying to purify its aspect into gold. They thought the axis was copper to gold. So maybe that's why Egyptians, I don't know, I consider it maybe more of a, in some ways, a more feminine culture. Certainly a death cult, and death to me is feminine. So copper is conductive. It's the opposite of resistive because it's harmonious in this way. It's how fast or fully energetic the heat, passion, or stimulation in our lives can move through us. You might say, well, isn't that Mars? Wouldn't that be all those things? You're like, can they be both? Yes. It's kind of how that martial energy can vibrate and move through you, and how you can transmute it into different, different realms. Maybe if you have bad copper, you never can really take that passion and change it, or it doesn't move through your physical body in a way, or just keeps stored in certain areas of your body. Maybe your anger and your rage is all here in your jaw, you Aries. You should actually take a lap. If you're in Aries, go outside and take a lap. Give me 10. Drop down and give me 10. I'm sick of y'all. I'm an Aries. The Venus temperament, well, this is going to be a big waste of breath. If you don't understand the qualities of Venus at this point without seeing my other videos, then I'm just really ashamed of you personally. But if you don't, I'll just say it anyway. Maybe I should give you a break. Maybe this is your first video. Love, arts, desire, everything you want, everything that is great about being alive, that's Venus. Copper is this anima, the feminine soul, and Mars is the iron animus, the masculine spirit. Until you can kind of bring these forces together in your life and learn to balance them or accept them fully, I don't know. You can't really become a complete individual. So Venus is copper is the metal of the household. So Venus is kind of like also kind of domestic in some ways, the domestic pleasures. Venus is, whereas Mars is tense, Venus is like relaxing and is relaxant to the muscle tissues, and it can be used in health and medically as well, but also in a temperament kind of way. If you repress or deny the forces of the masculine and the feminine, I want to say this, you'll either get strong aggression or extreme passivity. So you can't just pin it on Mars or Venus. You have to look at them both and the qualities of both, and how love is received and given, and how the psychological functioning of judging and evaluating situations. It's very, you'd say, oh, that's Mercury, right? Well, actually, it's our balance between Mars and Venus that gives us this sort of like level ground in which Mercury can operate and we can digest and interpret the data Mercury gives us, right? Mercury is just data. Data means nothing. Data means nothing. It's what you do with it. If I have, documents from the intelligence documents that are super secret and super sensitive, and I flush them down the toilet, I don't know if the rats in the sewers are going to be able to be as appreciative of those secrets as, say, someone in an embassy in Washington. So you have. I love what Dennis says. He says that transpersonal love without relationship, that's like going and being a monk and not really participating in relationships and just, I'm all about higher love, man. Transpersonal love without being in the laboratory of personal, immediate relationships creates a spiritual bypass where no ecstasy can truly enter your consciousness. And the samadhi and the states of bliss you're actually achieving are a fraud. You are fraudulent if you have not gone through your shit of personal relationships. Certainly, take all the time you need to readjust. You can divorce yourself from people for a time. But isolation and moving into reclusivity and all this sort of stuff without having experienced unconditional love in our day-to-day life, it just doesn't, you're just treading water. You're not going to be able to actually get to the heart of the matter. And anytime we're petitioning deities, we have to really be authentic. In fact, if your authenticity and your genuineness and your plea when you're making a petition to a deity, a god, or a spirit, a daemon, or a orisa, or a whatever you're doing, I don't even need to know. Don't tell me. I don't care. You may not even be doing it right, but it's going to work. The deity will sense your genuineness, will sense your earnestness. So to transmute this stage of, fusing the two egos or trying to test them in some way in terms of our personal relationships, we want to conjoin. We want to use the earth element operation of conjunction. Oh, this is really cool. The powder of sympathy was this cool thing where they took, say you got your arm ripped off, or say you got your arm bitten by an alligator or a crocodile in the Nile. Yeah, crocodiles. Rhymes with Nile. you would take this sort of copper powder, which is called copper vitriol, which is called the powder of sympathy, which is one of copper's only crystal forms. They would take a bowl of it, dissolve it in water maybe, and like put bandages of your wounds in the dissolved copper vitriol or copper solution. And basically, people, they wouldn't put it on your wound, they would put it in a bowl next to you and with your blood. And by sympathy and by conductivity, the healing influence or the heat from your wound would be absorbed into the substance, and you would feel this quickening of healing, this expedition of the healing process, the scarification process, or the clotting process, or all of the processes, this symphony of responses that respond when the body has been cut. So copper vitriol is just very interesting to study. I invite you to look it up. Even though copper is generally, I think, healing and supports Agni or increases heat in the blood in terms of Ayurveda, and it certainly does. If you take copper for a long time, your digestion will improve. If you have sort of a sluggish one, Mandagni, if you speak Ayurveda. But yeah, this etheric conductivity is actually quite cooling in this respect, in this instance. So copper was also said to strengthen the blood and clean the arteries. Powdered copper was rubbed on sore joints to ease the pain of arthritis, neuralgia, and rheumatism, and certainly you still see copper bangles being used for that. You can put copper around trees, to not where they meet, but like have the beginning and the end of the copper wire wrapped around the tree trunk, and you'll notice it quickens growth of the tree trunk, or the tree itself, I should say. Copper kills germs, fungi, and algae. I think they're using it in like gangrene. They're like making bandages of copper and putting it on the wounds, and it's basically eradicating gangrenous, or no, antibiotic resistant infections like MRSA. Have you seen that shit? Have you seen that shit? Okay, if it's resistant to whatever you're giving it and then copper kills it within like 10 hours, like come on people, come on. Copper coins dropped into a vase of flowers or aquarium will keep the water fresh for longer. So if you have fish, poopy fish water, use copper coins. Venus and copper rule the face, skin, and kidneys. So they're demulcic, antinephritic, and emetic. They'll make the body, they'll beautify the body. They'll make you appear more moisturized and just healthier in general. Less like you're dying. Venus-ruled plants affect celestial form and magnetic qualities and give an ability to attract the balancing forces that strengthen our will to live. If you don't want to live, your immune system's going to shut off, which I think is why a lot of people died of HIV so quickly and so rapidly. They were just, you have hopelessness, which comes from a debilitated or deficient Venus. If the pleasures of life are overshadowed by the promise of death, then you're going to die quickly. The actions of copper are anti-arthritic, anti-diabetic, anti-inflammatory, anti-spasmodic, anti-nociceptive, contraceptive, hypocholesterolemic, schizophrenogenic. Wow, those are hard words. Sorry if you don't speak English. Should I just power through and do them all? No, I'm not. I'm going to stop here on Mercury. I'm going to make a second video because I'm not going to do this to you on Shooters way. But anyway, so thanks for staying with me so far. Next time we're going to look at what? Mercury, silver, gold. Okay? You better watch the next one because this is the most important one. If you've watched it this far and you don't watch the next one, I will find you.